It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the call came through to the Pine Ridge Police Department. The dispatcher relayed the message. A local resident had reported a strange, overpowering smell coming from an old, abandoned house on the edge of town. The caller wasn't sure what it was, but it had been lingering for days, and it had grown unbearable. It could have been something as simple as rotting food or the remains of an animal, but the smell seemed far worse, unnatural, almost sickening. The kind of scent that burrowed into your skin and stayed with you long after you left. Officer Mark Daniels, the senior officer on duty, glanced over at his partner, Officer Rebecca Lawson. They both exchanged a look. Neither of them thought much of it. It was the kind of report that was all too common in a town like Pine Ridge, a small, sleepy place where nothing of consequence ever happened. The old house in question had been vacant for months, ever since the elderly couple who had lived there moved into a retirement home. Mark had passed it countless times on his patrols. The place was nothing more than a crumbling structure, overtaken by weeds and time. The officers arrived at the house not long after receiving the call, expecting nothing more than a slight nuisance. The house itself was set far back from the main road, tucked behind a line of trees, its dilapidated exterior a testament to years of neglect. The gray paint had long since peeled away, revealing rotting wood beneath. Shutters hung crookedly from their hinges, and the yard was littered with debris. It was the kind of house people avoided, either out of fear or simple disinterest. Mark and Rebecca parked their cruiser at the edge of the driveway, stepping out into the cool morning air. The smell hit them immediately. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was overpowering, almost nauseating. They looked at each other, both taking a deep breath before walking up to the front door. The air around them felt heavy, thick with an almost tangible dread, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. The kind of smell they were dealing with was something neither of them had encountered before. They tried to push it aside, but something about the whole scene made them uneasy. Mark reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly, as if a strange instinct was telling him that they were about to uncover something far worse than they had anticipated. The door creaked open, the rusted hinges protesting in the silence of the morning. As they stepped inside, they were met with a thick, suffocating darkness. The smell was even worse inside, if that was possible. Foul, acidic, and strangely metallic, like something had been left to rot far beyond any normal decay. The officers fumbled for their flashlights, the beams cutting through the gloom, illuminating the forgotten furniture and abandoned remnants of a life once lived. Broken chairs, stained rugs, and dusty old books lay scattered around the room. There was a strange, eerie stillness to the place, as if the house had been frozen in time. No signs of life, no signs of animals. Just silence. They moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet, their flashlights sweeping over every corner. As they passed a cluttered hallway, they noticed something unsettling, a large, dark stain on the floor, splattered in a way that suggested violence. It was dark, dried blood, but the scent, more pungent than the decay in the air, made their stomachs turn. Rebecca knelt down to examine it, her flashlight illuminating the jagged edges of the stain. There was something wrong about the pattern. It wasn't just a spill, it seemed deliberate, almost like it had been arranged, as if someone had gone out of their way to leave this mark behind. Mark, his pulse quickening, motioned for her to be careful. Something about the situation didn't sit right. The unease that had been building since they entered the house now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on them. Mark called for backup, his voice shaking just slightly, though he tried to keep his composure. As they moved further into the house, the strange feeling in their gut deepened. It was more than just a mess. The place felt wrong, almost cursed, as though they had stumbled upon something far darker than they could have ever imagined. The ominous silence, the bloodstain, the smell, it was all adding up to something far worse than a simple abandoned house. Just then, as they moved past the hallway and towards a door at the back of the house, Mark's flashlight flickered. The air grew colder, and something in the dark seemed to shift. They were about to discover something that would haunt them forever. As Mark and Rebecca stood at the threshold of the room, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The strange, oppressive air hung over them like a thick blanket, stifling and suffocating. Mark's flashlight flickered again, casting unsettling shadows across the walls. They moved cautiously into the next room, the beam of light sweeping across the floor, but it seemed to barely penetrate the thick darkness. The faint outline of furniture began to take shape in the beam of light, a torn couch, a chipped coffee table, a few scattered chairs. But what caught their attention wasn't the furniture. It was the walls. Scrawled across the pale paint, in uneven and jagged strokes, were strange symbols, cryptic, almost alien. They looked like they had been hastily written, perhaps in desperation, but there was something deliberate about the markings. Some of them seemed like nonsensical scribbles, others formed repeating patterns, like codes or languages that couldn't quite be deciphered. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as she examined them more closely. Some symbols had been hastily smeared, as though someone had tried to erase them, but the remnants were still visible, lurking in the corners of the room. Mark motioned for her to move back, his voice barely above a whisper. Something wasn't right. As they moved farther into the room, they saw more of the same symbols, scratched into the wood of the floorboards, etched into the door frames, some even smeared across the windowsill, as if the walls themselves had been alive with a chaotic, frantic energy. This wasn't the work of an average person. Whoever had been here had been trying to communicate something important, and clearly something sinister. Rebecca's flashlight landed on something unexpected. At the far end of the room, nearly hidden behind a broken bookshelf, was a small wooden door, its edges covered in dust and grime. It didn't match the rest of the room. It wasn't as old or dilapidated as the rest of the house. There was something about it that felt off. Mark approached it cautiously, his heartbeat quickening. He could feel the tension rising between them as if the room itself was holding its breath. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness. The air that escaped from the basement smelled even worse, more putrid, more rancid than anything they had encountered so far. The stench was overwhelming, thick and sharp, making both of them gag. Mark felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't want to go down there, but the feeling gnawing at him, the instinct that something awful was hidden beneath the house, was too strong to ignore. They hesitated for only a moment before descending. The stairs were narrow, covered in grime, and creaked with every step. As they made their way down, their flashlights illuminated the basement floor, which was littered with discarded furniture, broken boxes, and bags of what looked like trash. But it wasn't just garbage, it was the contents of lives, tossed aside like they were nothing. Old clothes, shoes, photographs, hundreds of photographs. Some were torn, others seemed faded from age, but they all seemed to be from the same place, Pine Ridge. As Mark scanned the pile, his heart sank. The photographs weren't just random snapshots, they were portraits, carefully arranged and pinned to the basement walls. The faces in the photographs were familiar, some even recognizably from missing person reports. Men, women, and children all staring back at them from the yellowed paper. The realization hit them both like a cold wave. These weren't just photographs. These were people. These were people who had disappeared in recent months, people Mark and Rebecca had seen posted on bulletin boards or heard about in brief news reports. The deeper they explored, the more they found. On a makeshift desk in the corner of the room, they found a series of notebooks, hastily written, filled with scribbled notes and cryptic phrases. One of the notebooks caught Rebecca's eye. It was filled with dates, each marked next to a name, some of which were scrawled in bold ink, as if they were of particular importance. Some of the names were ones they recognized immediately, names from the list of missing persons. Others, however, were unfamiliar. The discovery was disturbing not just because of the photographs or the unsettling presence of the hidden basement, but because of the realization that someone had been carefully tracking these people, documenting their lives, and, perhaps, their disappearances. It was as if someone had been following them closely, watching from the shadows, and leaving behind evidence of their twisted obsession. Mark flipped through the pages, his hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was erratic, as if the writer was in a hurry, or perhaps losing their grip on reality. There were mentions of something larger, something far more sinister at play, some kind of network, a group of people involved in the disappearances. It was becoming clear that the investigation into the missing persons wasn't just a matter of random events. It was organized, calculated, and it had been going on for much longer than anyone had realized. Rebecca took a deep breath, her mind racing with the same terrifying thought. Whoever was behind this had been planning for a long time. This wasn't just a series of isolated cases. This was something much, much worse. They were no longer dealing with a simple investigation. They had stumbled upon something far more dangerous, something that could be far closer to home than they ever imagined. The deeper they ventured into the basement, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Mark and Rebecca could feel the weight of the darkened air pressing in on them, thick with the stench of decay and something far more sinister. Every step they took seemed to echo in the cramped space, the creaks of the old floorboards amplifying the unnerving silence. Despite the chilling coldness that clung to the walls and the oppressive nature of the basement, neither of them could turn back. The unease that had built within them was becoming something far more urgent, as though the very ground beneath their feet was leading them to something they couldn't yet comprehend. They continued to sift through the scattered papers, photographs, and notebooks strewn across the floor. It felt like they were peeling back layers of a long-buried truth, each page, each photograph, leading them further into a labyrinth of twisted secrets. The names written in the notebooks weren't random. They were individuals who had vanished over the past few years, people from Pine Ridge and the surrounding areas. Some were familiar faces, people who had once been part of the town's daily life, neighbors, local teachers, shop owners. All of them had disappeared without a trace. What was most disturbing, however, was that the dates next to the names seemed to correspond to moments in time. It was almost like someone had been documenting their movements, keeping a record of when they went missing, and possibly how. There were notes scattered across the pages, some barely legible, others disturbingly clear. Phrases like disappearance imminent, tracking movements, and controlled response were written in messy ink. The chilling detail of it all was that whoever had written this hadn't just been following these people, they had been orchestrating the disappearances. Mark's fingers trembled as he turned the pages, his eyes scanning the unsettling notes. It was as though the writer had a deep knowledge of these individuals, where they lived, who they interacted with, what they did on a daily basis. But the strangest part of it all was the final entry on the last page. It read, *, final subject, Trent. Prepare for next phase. *. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat when she read the words. Trent. Michael Trent. The name had been floating in their minds since they had first set foot in the house. Michael Trent wasn't just anyone. He was a well-known detective in Pine Ridge, a man who had been investigating a series of disappearances for months before he himself vanished without a trace. The sudden appearance of his name in these cryptic notes was beyond alarming. If Michael Trent had been tracking the same people, could he have been a part of the case, or worse, had he become one of the victims himself? They exchanged a silent look of disbelief, both realizing the horrifying implications of what they had just uncovered. The more they thought about it, the more the puzzle pieces began to fit together. Michael Trent had been digging into the disappearances, trying to uncover the truth, and now his name appeared in the final note of a twisted journal. Had he been a target all along? Or was he somehow involved in this dark network? The questions piled up faster than they could answer them, and with each passing second, the reality of their discovery set in. They continued to search the basement, their minds racing with theories, but each new discovery only added to the confusion. A small, locked box was hidden beneath a pile of discarded furniture, wedged between two broken chairs. It looked old, weathered, and out of place. Mark crouched down to pry it open, his hands clammy from the tension in the air. Inside the box was a bundle of items that seemed unrelated at first glance, an old key, a set of worn-out clothes, and an envelope. The key looked like it belonged to something important, something hidden. But it was the envelope that made their blood run cold. Inside the envelope was a photograph, a grainy, black-and-white image of Michael Trent, standing with a man neither of them recognized. The stranger was smiling, but the image was unsettling for a reason beyond the normal discomfort of an old photograph. In the man's hand was an object that Mark instantly recognized, a piece of evidence from the investigation Michael Trent had been working on. It was a torn, faded piece of fabric, one that had been linked to the disappearances. This photograph, taken while Trent was still actively investigating the case, suggested something even darker. Why was Trent standing with this man, a man they hadn't seen before? Why was he holding a key piece of evidence that had been part of the investigation? Rebecca felt her stomach churn as she realized that this photograph might be showing a side of Michael Trent that no one had suspected, one that hinted at complicity. Had Trent been involved in the very disappearances he had been trying to solve? Or was this photograph evidence of something far more insidious? Was he part of a larger conspiracy, or was he another victim of whatever horrifying force was at work in Pine Ridge? The discovery of the photograph only raised more questions than answers, and the tension in the basement seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. They couldn't ignore the creeping sense that they had stumbled onto something far beyond their initial understanding. Whoever had been behind the disappearances wasn't just playing a game, they were orchestrating something much larger, something that had involved Michael Trent from the very beginning. The full scale of the nightmare they were now trapped in was beginning to take shape, and neither Mark nor Rebecca knew how much longer they could keep digging without plunging even deeper into the abyss. As Mark and Rebecca sat in the basement, the weight of their discoveries started to settle in like a heavy fog, making it hard to think clearly. They had found so much already, but with each new piece of evidence, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish the truth from the lies that had been woven into this dark web. The photograph of Michael Trent, standing with a stranger, holding evidence that tied him to the case. Had he been part of it all along? Or had he been dragged into something far deeper than he could have ever imagined? They couldn't stop circling the thought that this was all more than just an investigation into a few missing people. They were dealing with something far larger and more sinister. The box had revealed more than just the photograph. It had contained a small, worn journal. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, the edges of the pages curled with age. The writing inside was erratic, almost as if the person who had written it was losing their grip on reality. As Mark flipped through the journal's pages, his pulse quickened. It was filled with notes on the disappearances, but they were not just random observations. The author had been keeping detailed accounts of the people they had taken, their locations, their habits, and most disturbingly, the precise moment when they had been removed from society. There was an obsessive quality to the writing, an underlying sense of control, of watching everything unfold as planned. The further Mark read, the more he realized this journal wasn't just a record of disappearances, it was a blueprint for something far more coordinated. Dates were meticulously marked, and names listed in an organized manner, often next to phrases like disposal complete or subject secured. But what struck Mark the most was the chilling detail at the bottom of each entry, a list of times, as though someone had been tracking the exact moment of every event. It was as though the entire town was being watched, timed, and catalogued, as if it were nothing more than a game to the person behind it all. Then, the last few pages caught Mark's eye. There, scribbled in a hurried, almost panicked hand, were the final entries. Must prepare. They are getting close. Don't let them find out. Trent knows. Can't let him reach the truth. They will be here soon. Must act now. The urgency of the words sent a chill down his spine. Whoever had written these notes had been preparing for something. Preparing for a confrontation, or perhaps something even worse. Was it possible that Michael Trent had been getting too close to the truth, that he had begun to unravel the conspiracy behind the disappearances? If so, had that made him a target? Or had he been complicit all along? Rebecca stood silently, her face pale as she read over his shoulder. It wasn't just the chilling finality of the entries that left her feeling uneasy, it was the sudden sense of a ticking clock. Whatever had been planned, it was clear that the person behind it was no longer working in the shadows. They were making their move. And from the look of it, they were ready to do whatever it took to protect their secret. Mark slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing in the basement like a distant gunshot. They couldn't waste any more time in this room, not with so many unanswered questions and so little time before things escalated even further. There was no telling how much more danger they were in, or how deeply the conspiracy ran, but one thing was certain: the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Michael Trent's name was tied to it, but so was their own. They were no longer just investigating a case. They were now part of it, trapped in a nightmare that had only just begun. Rebecca's voice cut through the tension, barely a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Mark nodded, his mind racing as he scanned the room one last time. They had to get back to the station, to alert the others, to try and make sense of it all. But deep down, Mark knew that this was just the beginning. They had uncovered too much to walk away now, and whatever lay ahead, it was going to be worse than anything they could have imagined. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous this investigation became. They had no idea who they could trust or how deep the conspiracy went, but one thing was clear: someone had been watching them this entire time. And now, they were being hunted. The moment Mark and Rebecca left the basement, the world outside seemed to shift. The oppressive air that had clung to them in the house now felt heavier, more suffocating. The chill that had settled in the house had followed them out, and as they walked to their cruiser, the weight of their discoveries felt like a burden they couldn't escape. Mark's hand trembled as he reached for his radio, wanting to call for backup, to notify the rest of the department of what they had uncovered. But his mind was clouded with the raw fear of what might happen next. They weren't just dealing with an isolated case of missing people anymore. They were part of something much darker, a web of deceit and manipulation that seemed to stretch far beyond the town of Pine Ridge. When they reached the cruiser, Mark hesitated. Rebecca was already in the passenger seat, her eyes wide and filled with dread. She didn't need to say anything. They both understood that they had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The danger wasn't just a vague possibility anymore, it was real, and it was closing in on them. Mark started the engine, his thoughts racing. Should they go straight to the station, or was it too risky? Whoever was behind this, whoever had been orchestrating the disappearances, had planned everything down to the finest detail. They had left clues, yes, but those clues felt like bait, like the pieces were set up to lead them right into the heart of something more dangerous than they could comprehend. As Mark drove, his mind kept returning to the journal they had found, the cryptic notes written by someone who had been preparing for something major. The final entry had made it clear that whoever was behind the disappearances was no longer content with staying hidden. They were making their move. But the question was, what did that move entail? Was it simply a matter of eliminating anyone who got too close, or was there something more to the plan? He looked over at Rebecca, who was gripping the door handle, her eyes scanning the road nervously. Mark knew she was just as terrified as he was, but she didn't say anything. They didn't need words. There was an unspoken understanding that they were in this together, and whatever came next, they would face it head-on. When they reached the station, the familiar sight of the building did little to ease the tension in Mark's chest. The quiet hum of the office, the low murmur of voices in the distance, all felt foreign now. It was as if the very air in the station had changed, as though the case had somehow infected everything around them. As they entered, the receptionist gave them a curious look, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His instincts were on high alert, and he could feel that old familiar sense of being watched creeping up on him again. Mark pulled Rebecca aside. "We need to talk to Chief Ramirez," he said, his voice low. "We can't wait any longer. They're coming for us." Rebecca nodded, her face grim. They had to move quickly. If they didn't, they might not live long enough to find out the truth. As they approached the chief's office, Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Maybe an outburst, maybe a demand for answers, maybe even disbelief. But as they opened the door to Chief Ramirez's office, the last thing they expected to see was a cold, knowing smile on his face. Ramirez was sitting at his desk, his back turned to them as he looked out the window. He didn't seem surprised to see them. In fact, he seemed prepared. "I've been expecting you," he said without turning around. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. Mark's stomach churned, and he could feel the blood draining from his face. "What the hell are you talking about?" Mark asked, his voice tight with fear. The chief turned slowly, his smile still in place, but there was something different in his eyes, something unsettling. "I knew you'd figure it out sooner or later. You were always going to be a part of this." Mark's heart skipped a beat as he exchanged a glance with Rebecca. This wasn't just a revelation, it was a nightmare. Chief Ramirez wasn't who they thought he was. He was part of this. He was part of the conspiracy. "What the hell is going on?" Rebecca demanded, her voice rising. "Why would you?" "Sure," Ramirez interrupted, holding up a hand. "You're asking the wrong questions, Officer Lawson. You should be asking yourselves why you think you've been investigating the disappearances in the first place. It was always about you. You two were always part of the plan." Mark's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but they weren't the pieces they had expected. The chief had known all along. He had been playing them. They had been part of this twisted game from the very beginning. "We knew you were close," Ramirez continued, standing from his desk now. "The records. The photographs. They were all meant to lead you here. But what you don't understand is that it's too late. You've already walked into the trap. And now you're trapped." Suddenly, Mark felt a sharp, cold prickle at the back of his neck. It wasn't just Ramirez. It was the other officers standing in the shadows of the office, their faces expressionless, their eyes too still. There were more of them. More than they had realized. This was bigger than just one man, one conspiracy. it was the entire department. And now, they were the ones being hunted.